I want to take chapter 11 and I want to probe a little bit into what our posture toward the Jews should be. Now, I read recently, I don't know how recently, but it must have been fairly recently, because I read that just in the last 5 years or so, the worldwide Jewish population has rebounded and surpassed its pre-Holocaust numbers. Now, you know what the Holocaust was, right? At least most of you. Those years surrounding World War II when, the number that's always thrown out, the number that sticks in my head, 6 million Jews were executed by the Nazis in concentration camps and other places. 6 million Jews persecuted to the extent that they were actually killed. And the desire was to exterminate them completely. But now, after, 50 years, they have rebounded and surpassed their previous population numbers. And that got me to thinking, as I was thinking about this sermon, that, you think about this little nation that we read about through the chapters of the Old Testament. They had, just a few years of glory and true flourishing under King David, and then into the reign of King Solomon. And otherwise, this was, in a global sense, a very insignificant and a very small nation and a small people. Now, there are other much more powerful nations and peoples that we read about in the Old Testament. We read about the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites, but when is the last time you've met one of those? When's the last time you've met one of those? Years, generations ago, they were assimilated into other cultures and other nations and other peoples, and yet the Jews, throughout history since Abraham, have always remained a distinct people that defies all odds. You'd almost think that there is a divine hand at work here, right? That the Jews are still a thriving and flourishing people. And that, even considering that throughout their history, from biblical times, this was a people that was singled out for persecution and for hatred. It's amazing. It's amazing that they are still here. Why? Why are they still here? Now, I guess I've been exposed to two different perspectives on the Jews. The first one is something of a historical perspective, and the other one was relatively new to me. And I want to tell you what those perspectives were. Now, the first perspective, and you see this throughout history, and this is part of what fed into the Holocaust as well, is that even for Christians, the Jews were seen as the people who first and I guess most decisively rejected Jesus, their Messiah. And so in turn, God had rejected them. And so therefore, because of that, we are allowed to take a posture towards them and to somewhat cut them off ourselves, and to be unkind to them, and to look at them and perhaps even to persecute them. Because, hey, they turned their backs on God, and God cut them off. And so shouldn't we do the same? I mean, terrible atrocities throughout history have been justified with that kind of viewpoint, with that kind of thinking toward the Jews. So that's one viewpoint. Now that, by and large, I think has been corrected somewhat in our age of tolerance and love and, you're you and I'm me and we all have to accept everything about each other. So that's the one perspective. The other one I was exposed to in probably my mid-20s, and I was exposed to it very directly from a friend who was attending a church and was part of a small group that was doing an in-depth, multi-year study of the Torah. And so he was deep into these first 5 books of the Bible, the books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Just looking at those books and making contemporary applications to the extent that, most Christians would be somewhat uncomfortable with that because much of what we find in the Torah has to do with ceremonial and ritual law and that sort of thing. And he even got to the point where, he was questioning why that was all even done away with. And should we, as Christians, have stopped observing those things? But it was him, and I remember exactly where we were, and I remember exactly where he was sitting in relationship to me when he said this. He said, "Drew, I believe that somehow observant Jews that are faithful to their old ways, their Old Testament ways, those who are faithful to the Old Covenant will all be saved." The idea is that, when it comes to salvation, the Jewish people have their own thing going. Okay? They, even the ones that don't believe in Jesus as their Savior, the ones that believe Jesus is the Messiah, if they are serious about being Jews and if they are observing the old law and the old covenants, then they will somehow be saved. And I'm going to tell you something. In my mid-20s, that was an extremely attractive thought for me. The thought that God's grace would extend that far. I can see the attraction in a viewpoint like that. But neither one of those viewpoints are what Paul is talking about here in chapter 11. Neither of these perspectives is a functional perspective. And he's dealing with some of the same things. As a matter of fact, he actually addresses the Gentiles and says, hey, this is for you. This is how we should see the situation. He doesn't explain everything. There's still plenty of mystery involved in this grafting and cutting off and who is saved and who is not. There's still plenty of mystery involved. But he says this is how you Gentiles are to look at the situation with the Jews and with yourselves. And so he begins again with a question. As he did in chapter 9 and as he did in chapter 10, he begins with the question, did God reject his people? And he answers immediately. He says, by no means. And then he gives 2 examples of why, 2 proofs as to why God did not reject his people. And the first example that he gives is himself. He says, look at me. I am a descendant of Abraham. I am from the tribe of Benjamin. What's implied here is what his old life was as well. I mean, I don't think that you could find a more fervent opponent to Jesus Christ and the gospel than Paul was before that fateful day on the road to Damascus. I mean, Paul was intent on stamping out all references, all beliefs, everything having to do with Jesus, and he stooped to even terrorist tactics to achieve that goal. And yet, he says, God chose me, chose to reveal himself to me, chose to show me the light, chose to bring me in. Has God rejected the Jews? Absolutely not. And then secondly, he uses a historical example as well. He references the time of Elijah, when Elijah was prophesying to the people and pleading with them to return to the Lord. Turn away from idols and turn back to the Lord. Judgment is coming. And it talks about how Elijah felt like he was the only one in the entire land, the only one from Israel that had maintained a relationship with God, the only one who had not turned away. It turned out that that was not the case. What does it say? It says, I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So Elijah, you feel like you're alone, but you are not. Israel is still strong. There are 7,000 who remain faithful to me, a holy remnant chosen by grace. And that leads right into what it says in verse 6. And if by grace, then it's no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. And so here, one of those perspectives that I told you about a few minutes ago, that perspective that the Jews are somehow on their own kind of program, that is completely false. That is completely false, because that was the covenant of works righteousness. God saying, you obey me, you fulfill my law, and you will receive salvation. That is the covenant that the Jews were living under. That is the covenant that those Christians who view the Jews as somehow, automatically saved, that is the falsehood that they are under. That somehow for the Jews, even though they are just as imperfect as we are, that their works somehow count for them and are enough to earn salvation, whereas we Gentiles, we're under a different program. Yes, we sin and we fall short, and it is purely the grace of God for us that brings us in, which is the truth, but it's also the truth for the Jews. Verse 7, what then? What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain. It did not obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, and ears so that they could not hear, to this very day. So what does that say? That says that God has allowed a great many of Abraham's descendants to persist in their own way. See, God doesn't harden a soft heart, okay? Many of the Jews, many in Israel, had already turned away from him. They had hardened their own hearts. And so, in essence, God's hardening of their hearts was an allowing them to go their own way, at least for a time, so that they would reap the consequences of their actions, reap the consequences of separating themselves from God. But, as we will see, it's all for a purpose. Even God letting people stray and even God hardening people's hearts serves a greater purpose of drawing others, and even some of those whose hearts were hardened back into his umbrella of grace. So he has purposes in this. And this situation of hardening of hearts is not necessarily a permanent situation. It's not a permanent cutting off. Paul even says, verse 11, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? And he says, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. Think about that. So we have this wonderful blessing that flowed out of what? Israel's unbelief. Israel's unbelief. This is God working all things to the good of those who have been called according to his purpose. Even this terrible tragedy of Israel turning away from God, God switched around for good, and by that means, he was able to bring Gentiles into the fold. But that has a purpose as well. He brings Gentiles, he brings us into the fold to what? To make his first love envious. Is God done with the Jews? Absolutely not. God still loves his people. God still loves the ethnic Jews. God still loves the biological descendants of Abraham. He loves them so much that he has brought us into his gracious plan so that they might be envious and see what we have and want back in themselves. God continues to have a deep love and a wonderful plan for his first children. And we see this beautiful interplay of reciprocal blessings. Just as he said to Abraham, long, long ago, the nations will be blessed through you. And we see that the nations have been blessed through Abraham, through the Jewish people. And now Paul says that moving into the future, we have an opportunity, we of the nations, to reciprocate that blessing. To be the people of God in such a way that we are inviting and attractive to God's first children, the Jews. Then he closes with this image of the olive tree. Throughout the Old Testament, the olive tree was always a symbol for Israel. And the picture that he shows is that some branches, some natural branches have been cut off. So they're cut off, they're lying on the ground. They are no longer receiving that life-giving sap from the root of the olive tree, the root being Abraham, and more specifically, God's promises to Abraham. But then we have this kind of horticultural explanation of these wild olive shoots from other plants and other places being brought in and grafting on to that olive tree of Israel, creating spiritual descendants of Abraham. And that's us, brothers and sisters. And that image of us being grafted on to an olive tree that is thousands and thousands of years old, that God has sustained throughout our entire history, that plant that God will sustain till the very end, a plant that still bears fruit and has purposes and amazing, amazing things to offer the world. We get to be a part of that. But Paul makes it a point to say that you who have been grafted on from wild olive shoots, don't think that you are better than anyone else. Don't think you're better than those who were naturally part of this plant and were cut off. And then we have this amazingly hopeful statement of Paul, and it's actually elaborated on next week in the last verses of chapter 11. If God could take wild olive shoots from other plants and other places and graft them onto his tree of grace and salvation, what is to stop him from taking some of those natural branches that he cut off and grafting them onto the same plant, regrafting them? Because this is what he called them out for, because this is what he made them for. So in terms of our perspective on the Jews, it has to be a proper one. Now, Heidelberg Catechism question and answer 20, it asks the question, and this is very basic: are all people then saved through Christ just as they were lost through Adam? No. No, the answer is no. Only those are saved who through true faith are grafted into Christ and accept all his benefits. Whether it's Jew or Gentile, Jesus Christ is the way to the Father. Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. And so we are to see the Jews, we are to see modern day Israel just as we see our brothers and sisters close or far away that have not yet believed in Jesus. We are to pray for them. We are to welcome them in. We are to befriend them. We are to share the gospel with them because they need it just as bad as we do. And we do so, in that case, with a great deal of respect and appreciation for the heritage that they come from and the promises that they were given. Because in some way, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here either. And so God calls us to work that much more diligently to bring them and all others who don't yet believe into his folds and into his loving grace. Amen.